The Whispering Shadows of Briarwood House. It was a crisp autumn evening when Agnes Walker received the unexpected letter. The postman, an elderly fellow with a slight stoop, handed her the worn envelope with a cryptic expression. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping and delicate, as if it had been written in haste. The letter simply read, "Briarwood House is waiting for you. It will answer your questions." Agnes was no stranger to Briarwood House. It stood atop a hill just outside the small town of Elmford. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, a relic of the past, and shrouded in mystery. As a child, Agnes had been warned to stay away from the house, for it was said to be cursed, haunted by the spirits of its former residents. But she hadn't thought of it in years. Curiosity gnawed at her as she stared at the letter. She'd recently lost her husband, Thomas, and with no children of her own, her life felt empty. The letter seemed like a sign, an invitation to something that might hold the answers she so desperately sought. After weeks of contemplation, Agnes made up her mind. On a cold, misty morning, she packed a small bag and set off towards Briarwood House, determined to uncover the mystery of the letter. The journey was long and treacherous. The narrow, overgrown path leading to Briarwood seemed to shift with every step, as if the earth itself were conspiring to keep her away. The trees whispered in the wind, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. A sense of unease began to settle over her. When Agnes finally arrived at the mansion, the house stood tall and imposing, its windows dark and uninviting. The front door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her, and she stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and mildew filled her lungs. The house seemed alive in its silence, and as Agnes walked deeper into the cavernous halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows flitted at the edge of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She explored room after room, each one more oppressive than the last. The furniture was draped in sheets, and the portraits on the walls were all of people she didn't recognize, yet their eyes seemed strangely familiar, almost knowing. The feeling of being watched intensified, and she began to hear soft murmurs in the air, whispers too faint to understand but too clear to ignore. Her heart raced, but she pressed on, her determination overriding the mounting dread. Then, as she reached the grand staircase, a voice, a soft, sweet voice, called out her name. "Agnes, Agnes Walker." She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was familiar, but it couldn't be. It was Thomas's voice. She had heard it countless times in their years together, but he had been gone for months. With shaking hands, she grasped the banister and ascended the stairs, following the voice that seemed to echo from every corner. The whispers grew louder as she climbed higher, leading her to a room at the end of the hall, a room that had been sealed shut for years. The door creaked open and she stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a candle that flickered on a table in the center. As Agnes' eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There, standing in the center of the room, was Thomas, or rather, something that looked like him. His face was pale and hollow, his eyes sunken and vacant, but his voice was unmistakable. "Agnes, my love," he whispered, reaching out to her with a hand that seemed to float through the air, unnaturally still. "You've come back for me, but I never left." Terror seized Agnes's chest, and she took a step back, only to feel the door slam shut behind her. The room began to warp and shift, the walls closing in. The whispers escalated into a cacophony of voices, all calling her name, all begging for her attention. Suddenly, the floor beneath her gave way, and she plunged into darkness. When Agnes awoke, she was lying in a bed, an unfamiliar bed, in a room she did not recognize. The air was damp and cool, and there was a faint smell of decay. She sat up, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a dream? But then, as her eyes adjusted to the low light, she saw the figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was Thomas, but not the Thomas she had known. His face was now a twisted mask of sorrow and pain, and his eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, stared at her with a mixture of longing and despair. "You should not have come here, Agnes," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo. "You cannot escape what lies beneath this house." Agnes tried to move, to scream, but no sound came out. The walls around her seemed to close in once again, and the whispers returned, louder this time. They were not just Thomas's voice, but the voices of many, Hundreds, perhaps thousands, each one desperate, each one yearning for release. Suddenly, the room was bathed in an eerie, cold light, and Agnes saw them, shadows dark and formless, swirling around the edges of the room. They were the souls of the mansion's long dead inhabitants, trapped in a never ending cycle of torment. And now Agnes was one of them. Her body trembled as the realization set in. She had entered Briarwood House in search of answers, but the house had its own secrets, secrets that no one could ever leave once they uncovered them. As the shadows closed in, the last thing Agnes heard was Thomas's voice, soft and distant, saying, "Welcome home." This story is crafted to build suspense gradually, using unsettling imagery, eerie sounds, and a slow reveal of supernatural elements. You can expand on each part, adding more detail and sensory descriptions to make it longer, engaging the audience in a slow, terrifying build-up. This should comfortably take around 20 minutes or more to tell, especially if you add pauses and dramatic timing to heighten the suspense.